Your champion said yes. The pilot worked. The engineering team is excited. You walked into the next board meeting thinking the hard part is over. Then procurement calls, and legal has questions, and the VP of operations wants to know who's responsible if this thing breaks something that can't be broken. The person who loved your product can't protect you from the people who have to approve it. This is the moment growth stops, not because the product failed, but because you built for one buyer in a decision that requires five. This is why growth stops. A strategic briefing for founders and leadership teams at tech companies with real traction who can't figure out why growth isn't compounding. I'm Nico Fara, the PMF Architect. My guest today is Mike Dolbec, managing partner at Momenta Ventures, one of the leading venture capital firms focused on industrial AI and deep tech. Mike has spent more than 30 years in venture capital, starting at Kleiner Perkins and Greylock, then leading corporate venture at GE Ventures for 8 years. He sits on multiple boards of companies building AI products that control mission-critical operations, manufacturing processes, energy systems, and supply chains. He is also a founder himself. He co-founded Omnisky during the internet boom, took it through an IPO, and sold it. So he has seen this problem from every angle, as a founder, as a board member, and as the investor, who has to decide whether to keep funding a company whose best deals keep stalling. Mike, thanks for being here. Before we get into it, give the audience the quick version. What does Momenta invest in, and what gives you the pattern recognition?
Thanks for having me on your show. Invests in the digitalization of industry. And this typically means we focus on asset intensive operations, people who operate manufacturers, producers of energy, transmission of energy, transportation of people and goods from A to B, the extraction of raw materials in mining and, say, petroleum, transportation and logistics. All of those industries are responsible for, I think, over half of the world's GDP. And in general, they can't stop running. It's a bad day, as I think we're experiencing right now with the problems in the Middle East, when things are interrupted and there's a sort of cascading effect. So they're extremely focused on operations and continuity and safety. And they tend to, by default, steer a little bit south of being interested in novelty as their main priority. On your second question, I've been an investor for a long time, as you carefully pointed out. Thank you. And in the end, venture capital has a lot to do with pattern matching. And I see companies falling into over and over again patterns that I recognize. There aren't that many. They wear different clothes in different industries and different waves of innovation. But I guess I'm okay at pattern recognition. And I think that I can help a leader of a company maybe look around a corner.
Amazing. Thank you. In our pre-call conversation, you told me something that stuck with me. You said that when a technically strong team finishes a pilot, they think it's all downhill from there. And then you described what actually happens next as the dance of seven veils. Let's start there. When a portfolio company comes to you and says the pilot was successful, what's your first reaction? What do you actually hear when they say that?
Well, if it's a company that I'm meeting for the first time and I haven't already given them one of my standard lectures, I probe and ask if they've been also socializing the next steps with the customer as they go through the pilot process. Because if they don't, they're about to hit another roadblock. This is perhaps the first time the customer's been through this acquiring this kind of technology, and they may have proven that the pilot works to their satisfaction, but they still haven't thought about how to put it into production, how to deploy it, what organization change needs to happen in order for it to be effective. Who may be reluctant needs to be convinced that this is okay and that it's a good thing. And so there are legal issues, organizational issues, management issues, governance issues, all of which if you haven't been through it the first time, will cause a customer to go, huh, that's a really good question. And I don't care how well the pilot went. Let's take some time and rethink all these issues, and I'll give you an answer later. And so the expectation that money just flows after the pilot succeeds and a check falls out of the sky, it's very rare. And so the worst case is they didn't socialize these issues at all up front. And then they're surprised, and it adds another month or two or three or more to the sales cycle, which can be fatal if you haven't done your cash planning with that in mind. So basically move everything up front. Take the time as you enter the pilot to start negotiating what happens after the pilot. When we succeed in your pilot, then we go to phase one of deployment and so forth. And you will have by then worked out some of the issues that commonly come up so that we're ready to go into production when the pilot succeeds.
Amazing. Can you walk us through what typically happens in the weeks after a pilot succeeds? The founder thinks that they're converting to a contract. What actually happens inside the buying organization?
If it all goes well, you're right. Money flows out of the sky and you're really lucky. I've never seen that happen, but I look forward to that happening. So what may typically happen is that the person or the group in charge of confirming that the pilot succeeded checks the box and then turns to somebody else who isn't them, usually several somebody else's, turns to procurement or sourcing, whose job is to get the best price on the best terms for them and not you. They turn to legal, whose job is to make sure that they're protected and never wronged and never at fault, which generally is also a one-sided conversation. At least it starts out that way. Everything's your fault and nothing's my fault. You're liable for everything. You will indemnify me to all extent possible to cover any faults. Eventually, when you put it into production, somebody has to be responsible for good things, which is easy to be responsible for, but the potential bad things. That person will have that manager, that leader. Somebody will be maybe not worried about being fired, but certainly worried about being embarrassed. That person will also dream up all kinds of strange and wonderful things that might go wrong that the pilot didn't test, right? The pilot generally tests some sort of technical KPIs. We moved the needle, we increased output, we optimized something, we reduced scrap. But the pilot generally doesn't test when a mistake gets made, how bad is it? And who is at fault? And how do I prove that it is somebody's fault? All of these things generally come up afterwards. And in the most interesting case, to me at least, the most fascinating case, sometimes the pilot succeeds so well beyond everybody's expectations. This does tend to happen in AI more often than other times. You have a kind of political fallout because somebody else who isn't you doesn't want you to get all the credit for fixing the problem because to some extent they're embarrassed. And so there is a share of attribution politics that goes on. You know, you couldn't possibly be responsible for all of the good things that happened. My team had an epiphany after we went into production, and so we should get some of the credit for the fantastic results. And all of these things happen. I've seen them happen. That's, I suppose, the kind of problem you want to have because there's usually so much success left over that even if they took some of it away, it still sounds pretty good. But just be prepared for these things that aren't technical. And generally, the more subjective they are, the less analytical and easy to measure they are, the more people who are savvy will think of things to slow the sales cycle down.
What are the founders' reaction when they realize these things from your experience? Are they kind of coachable and listen and try to fix things, or they get disappointed and give up?
Yes, they're coachable, or else I wouldn't have invested. They're not in denial. I'm sure that they're disappointed because if I've invested in them, I warn them about this in advance. Usually keep an eye out for A and B and C and D. Often they are, begrudgingly, yeah, you're right. You did tell me about this. And I didn't prioritize it as much as I should have. It's a learning experience. really. Now, the worst situation is where it happens twice, right? It's okay to make a mistake. It's just fatal to make the same mistake twice that was avoidable. So
Right.
I think, yeah, people are pretty open-minded about it. Then they generally, so you
Okay.
didn't ask what do they do about it. They kind of build into their process some sort of checks and balances and checklists and things so that they don't let the same thing happen to them again. And you can tell the most sophisticated organizations are ones that have all these odd shaped arrows in their back from different things that have come up in their relationship with customers who are imagining everything that go wrong and how do I manage this thing when it goes into production. And they, they talk about the scary stuff in advance with the customer to sort of get them thinking about it and not wait until the last minute to every customer needs some time to go through these issues and get comfortable with them. So it's best that you start raising them early.
And you mentioned before that the whole product isn't just a technology. It includes the go-to-market strategy, the sales motion, the success criteria, and
Yes,
everything that happens after the pilot.
absolutely. There are multiple buyers and in some sense, different feature sets for each one of them. There are technical features for those people that evaluate the technical capacity of your product to achieve some goal, but there are support features or not for people that are concerned about that. There are governance and liability issues that are implied in contracts that need to be there. So the whole feature set is not just the speeds and feeds, it is the features that each buyer and decision maker and person who worries about risk needs to see in order for them to go, okay, I guess this is a safe choice. On the whole, better that we're doing it than we're not doing it. And particularly true for industrial AI and physical AI products that are sold into conservative organizations that are very worried about operational continuity and about safety. So the way you sell,
Mhm.
it's really the security blanket that you convince them you have and they should wrap themselves in. Inside our partnership, we often joke and say the biggest customers in the industry, the biggest OEMs, sell physical things and electronic software things, but what they really sell is peace of mind. And as a startup, it's very difficult to sell any peace of mind, but you have to struggle. And that's why I mean, part of the process of telling people what might go wrong is to help them think, oh, okay, they're being transparent. There is an issue. Their eyes are open. They can help me manage this and get past it. Thank you. As opposed to,
Mhm.
acting completely surprised when an anticipatable problem comes up.
Very good point. And also beyond the dynamic, there is the data side, and especially for AI, that's such an important part. So let's talk about data readiness. You described the situations where almost every pilot hits a wall because the customer's data isn't ready, isn't clean, or is controlled by someone the founder has never talked to. How does that play out?
Modern solutions that are enabled by AI techniques are empowered by real operational data and usually by pools of data that aren't just in one place, but often in different systems of record or acquired from sensors throughout a factory or some industrial situation and transmitted by strange and wonderful industrial protocols. And they're actually collected by imperfect devices. Occasionally there's dirty data. It's not entirely accurate. There's noise in the signal. It's not all signal. So there's issues with the quality of the data, the quality of the infrastructure that senses the data, because they're physical things and they degrade over time and eventually wear out. So the data quality can drift. There are issues with the pools of data, as I say, because in many cases, in a big company at least, different parts of your organization, A, they probably have control issues with sharing any data, but B, who is in charge of releasing access to some pool of data is usually spread out. So there's no czar of, I have all the data, just tell me what you want and sign here. Often there's a fair amount of detective work if you're doing something really ambitious and broad reaching. And so it, or they've never shared the data before. That's the other issue that's come up several times. They know they should share the data. They know they have the data somewhere. They just never asked for permission to share it outside of their four walls to a third party. And asking for legal approval makes lawyers question, okay, what are all the downsides of doing that? So data readiness maybe is too short a term. Maybe it's ready and able to share data readiness, or and the quality of the data is ready to share. That type of issue. For very large organizations, there's an issue of data sovereignty. Petrobras is the national oil company of Brazil. And the data, the operational data that they collect from their infrastructure is the property of the people of Brazil, or at least the government of Brazil, so presumably the people of Brazil. And sharing that with any third party is itself an extra credit exercise to get access to it. So, in some sense, the bigger the company or the span of control of the company that you're dealing with, in this case, the sovereign property of a government, can itself become an issue because if you're a US company, not everybody trusts people in other countries to keep their data pristine and not shared with the wrong people.
Thank you for sharing. So now let's talk about the root cause of the challenges the founders go through. What I think is that the founders commit to building for one person in the organization, often the technical champion, and never map all the other buyers who have to say yes. So I'm curious, in the deals that you have watched stall, how many people typically need to say yes before the contracts get signed? And how many of them did the founder plan for?
It's always more than one type of person, one function. I don't think I ever counted how many stakeholders there were. Let's see. I have seen situations where it's the CEO, the CIO, the head of the chief digital officer, the CISO, the head of security, the person who has responsibility for operations. So the plant manager, the person that isn't all those other things, but who will get fired if you stop making the widgets. And then legal, which in the largest companies often has different pieces. So, and I suppose related to legal is sourcing. That's worst case, hopefully not CEO, but you might, if it's a top down sale, do that. It's big company management. Some people need to be informed. Some people actually need to make the decision. Some people need to worry about what their risk is if somebody else makes the decision. But you can't take for granted that they've done this before with this type of thing and this type of situation. So you have to sort of help them through it. Try not to get stuck letting them do it the way they did for some inappropriate, the way they buy iron ore may not be appropriate for the way they pay for outcomes of a AI system. Raw material versus an intangible outcome achieving machine is somewhat different.
Right. And you have said something that I think is critical. The person in charge of operations often has veto power. And just because an executive sponsor likes you doesn't mean the operations leader will say yes. Can you walk us through what that actually looks like?
I think you're tiptoeing into the conflict that IT organizations and OT, operational technology organizations, frequently have. It's not like one person always says no, but it is often the case that one person on one side may say yes and the other may say no, not yet, until you satisfy everything else that I'm worried about. They each have different motivations and different risks, responsibilities, things that they're trying to manage. OT, let's see, nobody gets hurt, safety, operations don't stop, and we continue to hit our targets so that we make more money than it cost us to, make the thing in the first place. Crudely, that's kind of the top things. The IT organization has a different set of KPIs. I'm not a head of IT or a CIO. I can't confess to know all of them, but a lot of that has to do with of the total cost of ownership of all the soup of stuff that we've already got responsibility for. Does this make things worse by what measure? What's it cost to keep our eyes on it? Does it break something elsewhere in our infrastructure that would be a real pain and not worth it? So kind of what problem is this going to introduce that isn't obvious on the surface? The buck stops with me, so I got to worry about it. So I have to ask the questions up front. Those, and I think the mirror image on the OT side, if the IT person loves it because it's novel and what a great idea and it would help, doesn't introduce strange things to manage, it may accidentally make things worse on the operations side, which is unacceptable for OT leaders. So it's a careful balance. And I think increasingly I see decisions made jointly. It used to be people on two castles yelling at each other. I think now the metaphor is more like, okay, we're all on the same team. We just have different things that we need to protect and make sure they go well. I understand your role. At least I appreciate your role. You need to appreciate my role. We need to come to a good joint decision, good for the company. I see that happening more and more often now. So that's good. And where the budget comes from to pay for the thing moves back and forth too. So sometimes the budget is mostly with IT, sometimes it's with OT. Whoever has the budget has a pretty large voice in what happens.
Speaking of payment, you also mentioned that founders don't anticipate the payment terms, the discount expectations, the negotiation tactics. Is there a pattern to what surprises them the most?
There's no pattern that I know of other than some of the largest companies on earth. Instead of paying net 60, or net 30 was unusual, but instead of paying net 60, their opening terms may be net 90, net 120, which really is a negotiating tactic. Because right after they say, okay, we'll pay you in 6 months, they come back and say, but if you discount it, we'll pay net less than 6 months. It's just a sort of clever way to get a discount. And I think there are a lot of, that may be the most prominent one, but there's some other things in there that are, I call them hostages you're willing to trade in a negotiation. So if depending upon what kind of company the target customer that a startup has, I try and help them understand that they may be in this weird, they can't assume standard payment terms. And so one suggestion is maybe you ought to have a grossed up price that you're willing to discount back to get a reasonable set of payment terms. And you do have to respect the many different most favored nation clauses you might get yourself into, which is, I guess, the kind of problem you want to have. But big companies are really good at negotiating because they have most of the market power. And little companies don't have the same leverage. So they have to anticipate some of the power moves that large companies typically pull out of the bag. I guess you could guess that if a company historically doesn't have a reputation for acquiring software, digital technology, they might be less familiar with standard pricing terms and contracts. And to the extent it's a rocking high tech, we have lots of technology vendors we deal with. They probably have their standard terms, their standard way of doing things, which might feel more familiar.
Makes sense. So we've been talking about who the founder needs to build for. Now I want to talk about what they need to say to each of those people, because I think the alignment problem goes deeper than just knowing the stakeholder exists. The product tells one story, the champion hears one thing, and the rest of the organization needs to hear something completely different. You said something that stuck with me, that the buyers you work with, for them, the priority is the operational continuity, not innovation. As you called it, don't stop making diapers.
It's a bad day when you run out of diapers. Yes.
So how does that change what the sales pitch needs to look like?
Oh, from the startup's perspective to the big company,
Yes.
my advice there would be that you need to first satisfy the the sort of easy first hurdle is technical KPIs that you can achieve some improvement or more in something that they find important. The second hurdle is more subjective and a little hard to predict, but you need to convince them with apologies to Google or the Hippocratic Oath that you won't do any harm, that in achieving these good results, you don't accidentally achieve something else which is a negative. That is more difficult to claim and to prove, but it comes across really well if you thought about it. So I talk to a lot of companies that are using agentic technology to achieve something slightly better than raw humans are able to do. That's the goal, at least. And they usually can get there, prove it somehow in a concrete way. But then there are these governance issues that come up. How do I know it's doing what it's supposed to do and not something else that it shouldn't do? How do I manage it? Like I know how to manage a team of human people. If they go outside of the bounds, at some point it'll be obvious and it's understood that I may have to ask somebody to leave the company if they misbehave or if their results aren't acceptable up to a certain standard of quality. What's the equivalent? What are the equivalent metaphors for agents that you're delegating responsibility to? Historically, most software has been deterministic. In fact, in operations technology, it needs to be very deterministic. And the beauty and the promise, the excitement around agentic things is that it's by default often not very deterministic. It needs to adapt. It needs to perceive and almost make a judgment call and say, well, I didn't think about this one, but given the rules I've been given, I guess I should turn right instead of left or what have you. And so you're delegating some responsibility, maybe a lot of responsibility to a thing. And you need to know, you probably in hindsight want to know how did it come to whatever decision was made? And B, is there a log which is hopefully secure so that I can prove that it wasn't my fault that this thing happened. You could see the steps and they weren't tampered with or altered along the way, that I followed the recipe or I followed the procedures and something happened, maybe that was not anticipated, but it couldn't have been because I didn't follow the rules or the steps or the advice or the guidelines. That's a whole wishy-washy area of governance. I just read a blog this morning that was pointing out that in operational situations, some insurance carriers are removing their indemnity clauses for certain AI software because they feel that they can't underwrite the behavior. They can't underwrite the risk that something will misbehave. That's what it boils down to. Because in many cases, these systems are probabilistic. So the struggle is how many guardrails can I put there so that people feel better? And then how many breadcrumbs can I leave and notes can I create in logs to prove that I did what I was supposed to do within the bounds of responsibility I was given? These are issues that people are working on in real time. There is no well-known, well-understood. There's no society of automotive engineers for agents that says, you know, your turn signals need to work this way within these bounds or else it's unsafe. We don't have the same experience yet with agents. There's no fire codes because people used to build houses in a very haphazard way, and some were much more flammable and dangerous than others. But now there are codes that must be followed when you build a structure. to avoid some of the obvious things that put the occupants at risk. I think we're probably on the cusp of starting to develop a feel for those things. I wish we had some building codes stage, probably. Or, darn, that house burned down. I wonder what would prevent that the next time. And then you get to the building code stage, and then and after building codes, you need inspectors, right? You need somebody to audit that at least the minimum requirements were met so that some minimum level of safety can be ensured.
Makes sense. You also mentioned earlier that a lot of these buyers are looking to purchase peace of mind. So a technically superior product is worthless without support and integration as part of the offering. How do founders react when you tell them that?
Nobody who's created a brand new experienced by a new set of people that weren't used to, they're not exactly sure how they should fit it into their workflows, isn't entirely sure how they should support it to the satisfaction of the customer because they just don't have that experience yet. They know they have to support it. They know it's a work in progress, a bit of wet clay, and that they will adapt and figure it out over time. I think they're very sensitive to not shipping things that are imperfect, really imperfect, and don't work well enough, cause more problems to support than money you make to sell it the first time. And I have seen companies pull a code red type thing where they said, okay, no more new features. We have a problem with this feature set. We need to fix it, eliminate it so that we don't get any more customer support calls before we start implementing any strange and wonderful new features. So it kind of wobbles back and forth in the technical organization. Most startups figure we'll just figure it out. I mean, I'm not exactly sure the depth and breadth of the support, but we will figure it out as we grow. And they hope to live long enough to provide layers and layers of support or professional services to some extent, both the design up front, but support later. But I think they may underestimate how much support an industrial organization would prefer. My guess is that all things being equal, industrial organizations would rather hire somebody else who's real smart and keeps up on all the latest buzzwords to accomplish something than to build a internal organization and constantly keep it refreshed. That's kind of expensive to be smart enough to keep up with supporting itself.
A lot of founders think that having a channel partner solves the go-to-market problem. You described a gap between what startups sell, the shiny thing that does something better, and what channel partners sell, the security blanket. How does that misunderstanding hurt the founder?
The good part is that there's somebody else that has a productive relationship with a customer. And so the time to money is potentially short. That's if everything goes well. The bad news is there is somebody else between you and your customer who may or may not communicate. You're not there with the customer always learning what other issues they have. I mean, the beauty of forward deployed engineers is that while you're getting paid to do the work that you were hired to do, you can have conversations about what else is going on, what are the issues and challenges that you have. It becomes a kind of early sensing network for features and ideas and new product extensions that you don't typically get because you're not having intimate conversations with your customer all the time. So if you have a standard product that doesn't rapidly evolve every day, doesn't need to, and it's relatively stable, I suppose channel partners are great and ideal. If you're still trying to figure out who are my customers and why did they buy my stuff and what do I need to polish and what rough edges do I need to smooth off, which customer set, which subsegment do I need to focus on because they get it and they want to pay me and they're in a great deal of pain and have urgency versus other people that are just going to waste my time. Eventually you're able to figure it out, but you have to manage the communication through the channel partner often just as much or more because they may not appreciate the issues that you're listening for, or they may not pick it up. They may not communicate it. The ideal channel partner, I guess, is an extension of your company and your priorities. And the worst one is I tried to take an order and they didn't give it to me. And that's all you get. So it spans the gamut, I suppose.
I love that you brought up the decisions. What I call is like 3 layers of go-to-market. The first one is the decisions, the other one is the strategy, and the third one is the execution. And a lot of times founders think of just the execution. And so like channel partner falls into that, or cold outreach or other lead gen tools are in the execution layers. But a lot of times founders skip the first 2 layers. So really good point on that.
Particularly in the customer discovery phase, where if you're intellectually honest, every customer seems different, or they are effectively buying something different from you because they have a different vision of what you're doing and what you're delivering. And what you're trying to do is discover, which 3 people want to buy the same thing from me so I don't have to customize it for them. Because if apparently you didn't know that from the outset. So you're trying to figure it out on limited resources. During that phase, that's where a founder-led sale is huge, because the people with the vision who created the company to solve a problem get to hear from the people there they thought they were solving the problem that it's pretty close, but it could be better, feature-wise or support-wise, as we talked about before. So there's always a kind of, gee, I wish the wheels were green, not red type conversations. And if you hear that a couple of times, you go, let's try green, see if that's more successful. But you don't hear that unless you're in the flow and conversation.
So we've covered who the founder needs to build for and what they need to say. Now let's talk about the signals, because I think one of the reasons founders get stuck in this pattern is that they are reading the wrong signals and they're not being honest about what signals actually mean. From your board seat, what's the earliest signal that tells you a company is about to hit this wall before they know it themselves?
Every young company tells itself and its investors stories about the future success they're going to have. It's just, you got to have vision, and it's communicated through stories, and we love stories. In fact, if you don't have stories at that stage, it's a little scary. But at some point, the stories have to start translating into results. And the scary part for me is where you sort of feel like they should be having more results by now, but the board meeting is mostly a story or 2 or 5 about what happened when I met somebody or what I learned or what we did, but never, and it resulted in they gave me money for my product. It's sort of the story to results ratio, if I could quantify it that way. If it goes on for too long, is a bit of a red flag. It's natural, I get it. I mean, I've been a founder. When you don't have results to talk about, you probably have been out beating the bushes a lot. And so you do have a lot of stories, but you have to be intellectually honest and say, if at some point all I have is stories, I have a problem. I need to do something that creates results so that I have more than just stories to fall back on. The other thing that is important to be intellectually honest about is sometimes the stories are basically, we did a lot and then we got stuck. But not being honest about how the deals are stuck or why so many are stuck in a certain way is a bit of a red flag too, because the job of the leader is, one of the jobs is to figure out the problem and then take responsibility for solving it. And in this case, if there are deals that are getting stuck, perhaps in legal, perhaps in procurement, I listed many ways in which they can get stuck or slowed down. Your job is to figure out, this seems to be a pattern. And in order to diminish this pattern or eliminate it, what do I need to do? My simple logic was start telling them about the problem before the last minute and they slow everything down. But often it's an education thing. It's like tell somebody there's going to be an issue that'll give you pause, and here's how you should think about this issue. Here are the pluses and the minuses, and then here's what I think you should do. Here are the downsides. And just helping them through that often speeds up their own process of getting comfortable with things.
Good point. And you mentioned that you can't pay your employees in good vibes.
No, you
So
can't.
it's important to convert this motion into traction. And I'm curious, how do you distinguish between a founder who is genuinely optimistic and one who is avoiding the reality?
Oh boy, I wished I knew. Well, they're all over optimistic, right? You have to be, or else you wouldn't do this scary thing called risk everything and start a company that most odds say won't succeed the way you hope it will, despite how hard you work. So you have to be optimistic that you'll achieve the goal, and then optimistic as you get feedback along the way that it's not going perfectly. You just have to button down and not get too ground down by that. The way I do it is different. I guess it's the way other people do it. I tend to want to be a thought partner of the leader of the company, a safe space to talk about what the challenges are. My job is not to solve your problem. My job is to help you understand and focus in on that there are problems and help you think through what your options are. Remind you it's your responsibility to solve the problem, but help you think through and talk out what your options are. I've found that when I can get people to talk about their logic, talk about the way in which they're encountering the problem and thinking about their options, they often have some sort of epiphany that's helpful to address the problem. First of all, you can't solve everything. Great. And second of all, you probably ought to focus on the things that are a big problem and you think you can solve, because everything else is probably wasted effort and you might as well save your energy for those things. But after you sorted down those, like, what can I do that would help? And what's the most important thing I can do that would help? That's usually a big payoff anyway. So that's how I deal with people. And if I can't get them to pass the, oh my God, the sky is falling, then we have a problem. Or sometimes they realize that the company has outgrown them and that this set of issues at this stage of life of the company is not what they signed up for. It's not as fun as they thought it might be, or it's not as rewarding. The quality of life issue is not worth it. So maybe they would like some help. Maybe we can build a team around them that would help them better negotiate these issues. But they have to first acknowledge that there is an issue in the first place. If they don't, then maybe that's the worst kind of problem is, I got this, leave me alone, don't criticize me, I'm embarrassed. That's kind of a downward spiral usually.
And I think you have a lot of empathy for them because you've been a founder before. So let's talk about your founding experience. So you built Omnisky, took it through an IPO and sold it. Was there a moment during that experience where you were the founder making one of these mistakes and you now recognize from the other side of the table it's happening?
I remember one very distinctly. At the time we were raising a private round and anticipating going public after that, it was during the internet bubble, before the bubble burst. And office space all over the Bay Area was in an extreme premium. So if you were a growing company and you needed a place to put people, you had to deal with a lot of landlords that were charging a lot of money, more than they should perhaps per square foot. So one of the jokes was we pitched more landlords than we did VCs. And the landlords were very, very sophisticated about the type of business we were building and the risks that we had and when would they exit and who else were the investors and let me see the resumes of the management. But the problem that I'm eventually getting to was that because office space was so tight, we overcommitted a large amount of our capital to real estate, to rent, because you just had to do that. You had to make a kind of non-breakable commitment to pay rent in the future to occupy the space now. And I don't know what the equivalent would be today, but in hindsight, it was a completely bad decision and it was avoidable because we just could have lowered the quality of life in the office. Nowadays, people don't go to the office, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're on the verge of, if you're talking yourself into making a large capital commitment, which essentially it's money you can't spend when you need it elsewhere, that really does tie a boat anchor around your feet. And it became a real operational issue that screwed up the company. So in hindsight, avoidable capital commitments, things that you talk yourself into spending a lot of money on because you think it's the right thing to do for the future, often backfire and limit your ability to zigzag around an issue that you wish you had the flexibility for in the future. That's, I think, the thing I regret the most was not being able to be as flexible and creative and responsive after we had tied up too much cash.
So the equivalent might be overhiring.
Well, you'd have to hire a lot of people, but in miniature, yes. Hiring too soon is usually found in a sales team, whereas an inexperienced founder might think, great, now I'm ready to grow. I just raised a bunch of money. I will hire a bunch of salespeople and that will accelerate my progress. And what they don't factor in is that these salespeople aren't the founder, so they don't innately know how to sell the value proposition. It may take them 6 months to become effective. They may discover, because they're mere mortals, all of the flaws in your product that you can easily get around because you can sell the vision. They can't. So a lot of these scale with lots of people sometimes makes perfect sense, but often until you know you have a stable product and a stable customer and the customer knows why they buy it, it can be challenging, it can be reckless.
What Mike described today is one of the most dangerous patterns in early stage growth, mistaking validation for product market fit. The champion said yes, the pilot worked, the usage data looks great, every signal says we have traction, but none of the signal came from the people who actually approved the purchase. The founder over-indexed on the signal that felt good and ignored the signal that was missing. The missing signal is silence. It's the procurement team that hasn't been engaged. It's the legal review that hasn't started. It's the operations leader that hasn't been consulted. Silence from those stakeholders isn't neutral. It means they don't know you exist. And when they discover you at the last minute, they react with suspicion, not enthusiasm. This is why I say product market fit is not discovered, it's decided. And you can't decide it based on one buyer's enthusiasm. You decide it when you have mapped every person who can kill the deal and built your product, your pitch, and your sales process for all of them. Growth didn't stop because the product was wrong. It stopped because the founder heard yes from the person who couldn't actually buy and stopped asking who could. Mike, that was exactly the kind of conversation I built this show for. Specific, experienced, and honest about the founders get wrong. Thank you for sharing these patterns and your experience.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me and giving me a chance to opine on a few of these issues. They're very important and they're evolving in the world of AI. So it's fun to talk about them.
Amazing. If you want to connect with Mike, find him on LinkedIn. He is the managing partner at Momenta Ventures, one of the top industrial AI venture capital firms. If what we talked about today sounds like what is happening in your company, if your best deals keep stalling after the champion says yes, the full article with all the key insights is on my website, productmarketpro.com, link in the description. This has been Why Growth Stops. I'm Nico Fara, the PMF Architect. See you next month.